So here we go. This is our week 2, lesson 3. Um, this is the last thing we're going to go over for this week before you guys have the quiz that you need to take. Again, when you go through those quizzes, take it until you get at least like a 70, 75%, uh, and then you'll be done for the week. So, what we started out with was graphing circles, writing the equations for circles, um, and determining how a point is related to a circle. What we're ending on is using completing the square to make these equations look like the equations for circles. Right now, completing the square is something that we touched on a few times earlier in that unit, which is unit 7. So you can refer to your notes there, but we'll kind of go over a brief way of doing completing the square and looking at that again. Now, notice when you look at this equation right here, there is no way to look at that and say, oh, the center is like 2, 1. The radius is 6, right? We can't do that. You can't just look at that and say that what the center and the radius is. So what we have to do is go through and do completing the square. Now when we're doing completing the square, we follow some steps. The first step is to group the common terms. So I'm going to just say group common terms. So we're going to group the x's with the x's, and we're going to group the y's with the y's. That 4 that has nothing to do with anybody, the x's or the y's, we're going to take that and push it over to the other side. So we're going to add 4 to move it over, right? You do the opposite operation, that adds it over. So we're going to group our x's, x squared minus 2x. We're going to group our y's, and we've pushed that 4 over to the other side. Now it's a positive 4. This is when we want to go through our process of completing the square. Now what I recommend you do is, let's break up the x's and the y's, and what I'm going to do is rewrite it, so now we have an extra space for us to actually go through and complete the square. Now the process of completing the square, once you see it, it's going through the same thing every time. We take b and divide it by 2. Right now, b is this number in front of x there, or this negative 4 that's in front of y there. We divide it by 2, so we're going to start with the x's. Negative 2 divided by 2. Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. We square that, completing the square, and that gives us a positive 1. Now, if you don't remember that positive 1, we take it and we add it on to the end of our equation, right? That's us completing the square. For us to do that, though, we have to balance out the equation. If we add 1 to the left-hand side right here, we have to go over to the other side of the equal sign and add 1 as well, right? So now we've balanced out the equation. Now we're going to go through and do the same thing with the negative 4, completing the square for the y's, right? We're going to go negative 4 divided by 2. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2, and negative 2 squared gives us positive 4. Again, that 4, we take it and we add it on to the end of that equation. But again, to balance that out, we have to go and add 4 to the other side. That balances our equation out. Now, the nice thing is we can finish our equation, right? We can actually write the equation from this. You can look at this, and using a nice little shortcut that we have talked about in class, we can write this as, we're dealing with the x's for this first piece on the left. We can write x, we're going to have something squared. That something is right here. When we did b divided by 2, we got negative 1. We can just go x minus 1 squared. Now, if you don't trust me, you can take x squared minus 2x plus 1, do the diamond method, the two numbers that multiply to 1, and add to negative 2, or negative 1 and negative 1, which would give us x minus 1, x minus 1, which we can then write as x minus 1 squared. That's why we use the shortcut. I recommend you just use the shortcut unless you want to factor using the diamond method, which I'm fine with. The second one, we're working with the y's, so we put y plus or minus something squared, and since again this is a -2, we're going to go minus 2 squared. Perfect. Now the left hand side looks exactly like how we need it for completing the square. The last thing, 4 plus 1 plus 4 is 9. Right? From that, we're in the equation of a circle. We could go through. We could find the center. We could find the radius. Right? Which would then allow us to graph it. Let's do that real quick. We'll look at it, the center, -1, -2. We think opposite, that's a +1, +2. The radius, 3 squared is 9, or the square root of 9 is 3. So the radius is 3. So we could graph that circle, right? It has a center of 1, 2, and a radius of 1, 2, 3. So you go up 3, right 3, down 3, you know the drill. That's our circle, right? But we did that from that equation at the beginning that looks like a mess. This is where you need to be able to end up, right? Because once you get to that equation right there, we can find the center easily. We can find the radius. So we're going to look at one more example. It's a little bit different, right? Of course, we have to do a different example, but you look at this. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to graph it and find the center and radius. But we look at it. Now we have x squared plus y squared equals 8y. Now again, the first step is to group your common terms. So we want this x squared, we want that x squared to be grouped up, but there's nothing to group it up with, so we don't have to do anything. But that y squared, we want those to be grouped up. What we can't do is just put them next to each other. We have to move this 8y over, just like we moved that 4 over on this equation right here. Since we're moving it to the other side, we're going to do minus 8y instead. So we'll end up with x squared plus y squared minus 8y equals, this becomes 0 because we moved that 8y, and now we can go through completing the square. The nice thing here, this is just an x squared. We don't have to do completing the square. It doesn't have this 6x or a 4x combined to it, so that's just going to tag down for the entire process. All we have to do is completing the square on this right hand part right here. So I'm going to drop down and write it, whoops, give me a second, sorry, write it as y squared minus 8y. We put our little space there, and we're going to complete the square. So again, how it works, you take that middle term, that -8 right there, divided by 2. -8 divided by 2 is -4. -4 squared is 16. So we add 16 onto the end there. But then again, to balance it out, right, we go to the other side of our equation and we add 16. Right, so now we can drop down and write our equation. Again, that x squared, it just keeps sitting out in front. It stays as x squared, right? But now we can go plus. We use our shortcut. We were doing completing the square with the y, so we go y. When we did b divided by 2, we got -4 right there, so we go -4 squared equals 0 plus 16 is 16. And that right there is your equation. Now, I realize now that all of ours ended up with x minus or y minus. That's not always the case. Say instead we went through this process, instead of this being let me do this in blue so you can see the differences. Instead of this was y squared plus 8y, right? If that's the only change I made, now this is a +8 divided by 2. Changing that to a +4, what that would cause is this to be y plus 4 squared instead. So make sure you actually look at what that that number is there. If it's positive, make it a plus. If it's negative, make it a minus. But let me go back. and adjust our equation back to where we are. This is our equation, and again from that we can find the center and the radius. Hopefully this is getting redundant. Like hopefully you can just look at this and know what the center is. Now again, there's nothing attached to this x right here. So for our center, the x is just 0. For our y though, since that's a minus 4, we do the opposite. So our center is 0, 4. We can graph that, right? 0, 4 would be right here as a center, right? Then we find the radius. Again, the radius is that 16, but it's not 16, it's what number squared is 16? So the radius is 4, or you can do the square root of 16 is 4, telling you that to complete the circle, we're going to go right, 1, 2, 3, 4 from the center, left, 1, 2, 3, 4 from the center, down, 1, 2, 3, 4 from the center, and then up, 3, 4 from the center, hopefully giving us a nice circle. If I ended up doing that well, that's mediocre, but that would be our circle there. Now again, make sure you know when you have to do completing the square, it's usually when we have a y squared and another y attached to it, right? It's not just set up like this equation here on the left. But that's the last thing we're going over for this week. That's the third lesson, completing the square for circles. Make sure you know how to find the center, find the radius, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask me.